Hi everyone, this is Morgan, and in this video I'm going to talk about how to shoot and unload a roll of 35mm film. This video picks up right where the last video on how to load a roll of film ends, so if you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to watch that video. If you have watched that video, you will know how to change both aperture and shutter speed settings on this camera, the Nikon FM10, and some of the newer Canon models that we also have. You'll know how to change those two things. You won't know how to read the light meter necessarily, and you won't know how to meter. So that's the first thing we're going to talk about. The golden rule, especially of going out for your first shoot with 35mm analog film, is to never forget about your light meter. It's surprisingly easy to do. First, I want to talk to you about how to read the light meter in the FM10. And to do that, I'm going to give you a look inside the viewfinder. So just show you some pictures I took by literally putting my smartphone camera right against this viewfinder here to show you what you'll be seeing. So looking through the viewfinder, I can see my light meter on the left-hand side. In order to get a reading, you need to lightly cock the film advance lever and then just tap the shutter release. You obviously don't want to press the shutter release because that will take a picture, but you do want to tap it to trigger the light meter. So once you've done that, your light meter will give you a reading. And here you can see it's giving me this lit up green dot as my reading. Below it, you should see there's also a plus and minus symbol. So we're going to walk through what each of those means. However, before we even worry about what actual readings mean, at the beginning of a shoot, and especially if it's the first time you've worked with this camera, when you look through the viewfinder, I would encourage you to start pointing at different things, especially things that are lit really differently, and trying to just gently take readings by, again, tapping the shutter release. So when you do that, if you're pointing at something really bright, you should notice that your reading is different than when you point the lens at a shadow. If you don't see things changing, if your meter readings don't change, that might mean your battery is dead and that you need to get a new battery in order for your light meter to work. So check that at the beginning of each session. If you realize your battery is dead when you're already shooting, there are light meter apps available for smartphones that you could use just as a holdover. So once you've established that your light meter is working, your readings are changing, we can now switch back over to deciphering those readings. Here you can see this is an underexposed reading. We see the minus sign, and we also see nothing else flashing, so just the flashing red minus sign. That means it's over one stop underexposed. Next, we're going to look at an overexposed reading, which is pretty much the same deal in reverse. We've got a red plus sign, nothing else. You also have these mixed readings, which will give you this little green dot in combination with a plus or minus sign to say it's a little overexposed or it's a little underexposed within one stop. So you can often get good or at least workable negatives by shooting within these mixed readings. But this is what a correct exposure looks like. This is what we are ideally aiming for. Switching over to the other camera I loaded, the Rebel 2000, you can see the light meter here is at the bottom of the LCD screen. So just like with the FM10, you trigger the light meter once you are in manual mode after having switched from L mode locked. You will just tap the shutter release to trigger the light meter. So then you'll get readings. Now that I've gotten my first light meter reading, you should see that there is a line flashing near the -2 symbol. So we know that this is 2 stops underexposed at the current settings. So for us, that means we can change either aperture or shutter speed to accommodate that. So first you see me switching over to the correct exposure by changing shutter speed. If I keep going, you'll also see me press into overexposed territory and then back to a correct exposure. So that is how you read the light meter on the Rebel 2000 and most of the other late 90s, early 2000s cameras we have. Now that you know how to meter, you should be ready to shoot. So I'm going to show you what that looks like for me. Here you can see me working with the Nikon FM10 and I'm adjusting the zoom. I'm tapping on the shutter release to get a meter reading. And in between that process, I'm going to adjust things like shutter speed to make sure that I have correct exposures. When you're hand holding, you also want to remember that shutter speeds must be 1/60th of a second or faster if you'd like to avoid camera shake. Next, you can see me adjusting aperture, that closest ring on the lens, and then moving to the front of the lens to adjust the focus. So while this is relatively simple, we're actually juggling a lot here. We need to remember to consider exposure. So exposure relies on both the shutter speed and the aperture working together. You also need to pay really close attention to the light meter. Even slight changes in lighting can really affect this, so don't just put one setting in and then think your whole session is covered. There are 36 frames in a roll, and most of you will not want to shoot those all at the exact same time. So feel free to take pauses in shooting. In between using the camera, just make sure to take care of it. A good thing to do is to note what frame you're on. Again, that frame counter is just above the film advance lever. It's also a good idea to keep the lens cap on when the camera isn't being used, just to avoid any extra battery power being spent with the camera trying to make readings while it's not being used. For the Rebel 2000, again, you just want to switch your mode dial back to L, which effectively turns off the camera. Some of the other newer camera models we have are slightly different. Some of them actually have power buttons. Just figure out how to turn the thing off so it's not constantly using energy. So the next thing to ask is, what do you shoot? If you're feeling stumped, a great thing to review if it's been a while since your last photo class is maybe doing the same exact photo, but shooting with different aperture settings. So obviously adjusting your shutter speed to compensate so you end up with correct exposures for both, but just sort of reminding yourself how aperture affects depth of field. You could do the same exact exercise with shutter speed, and again, you'll need to also adjust your aperture to compensate for having wildly different shutter speeds, but this might remind you of how shutter speed affects motion. When shooting through my rolls, I used a tripod, which you can borrow either from Art Photo or also from the library. And I use this to do some more experiments. So one thing I did was shoot with the bulb shutter speed setting, which allows the shutter to be open as long as you press the shutter release button, which allowed me to do some night work. I also used the timer setting on the Rebel 2000, and you can see the 10-second, flashing light here, which allowed me to do some self-portraiture. Basically, the tripod just allowed me to do any exposure that was longer than 1/60th of a second without getting camera shake. So feel free to do that if you'd like. My general wisdom is just to not look at each roll like you're supposed to make 36 individual masterpieces. That's not possible. I would instead look at each roll like maybe you pick 4 or 5 subjects you're really interested in. Maybe you shoot at a time of day with light you're really fascinated by, and you just study something. If you find a subject you're really excited about, it's more likely you're never going to be upset about having 10 different variations on a really good photo as opposed to 10 kind of lackluster photos of things you didn't care about. So just zero in on things you're actually excited by. When you're done shooting your first roll of film, you'll need to unload it. So I'm showing you how this will look on the FM10 first. Here you can see I'm actually trying to advance the film advance lever. I'm trying to press the shutter release, and neither really goes anymore. If you look in the frame counter, you should also see that you've gotten to about the 36th frame. So since our roll is completely shot, I'm going to need to rewind all of the film I shot back into the film canister before I open the camera back. This is because the film, again, is light sensitive, so I want to rewind all of it back into that canister before I open it. Before doing that, I'm going to flip the camera over and look for the film rewind button, which you see me circling with my thumb here. I will need to depress that before I even try to rewind my film. So I'll continue to press down on that rewind button while I flip up the rewind knob. I'm going to actually play you the audio from this part. So now that the film is fully rewound, I can pop open the back of my camera again using that lift of the rewind knob, just like we did when loading. And now I don't know why I had to press that knob. I'll have to reopen it and yeah, there, I figured it out. But now I can pull out film, close the camera back, and I now have a completely shot roll of film out of the camera. It looks different from loading. You'll notice it used to have that little liter of film coming out. We know this is shot because this one doesn't have that. So now we'll switch over and talk about unloading with the Rebel 2000 and other newer cameras. You'll know that you're done with a roll when you're probably in the middle of shooting like I was and you hear a whirring noise. I thought I had a few frames left. I actually wanted to record the noise, but it's a lot like the sound it made when I was loading, a kind of whirring noise as the last little liter of film was rewound into my film canister. So like the process of loading film being somewhat automatic, this is somewhat automatic. And after my film has been rewound back into the canister, you should see this on your LCD screen to let you know that film has been totally rewound. So knowing that, I just took my camera, and you don't have to do anything to rewind it. It's not like with the FM10. You basically just need to open the back of your camera. You actually see me struggling with that for a minute. My nails are not long, just need to press up on that lever. And then your film is already rewound for you. So I pull it out and I'm done. That's the whole rewinding process with the Rebel 2000. So even simpler. So at the end, again, make sure that your camera mode is switched to L so it's locked and your camera is off. But now you have, again, a completed roll of film. So in an ideal universe, you would still have those black storage containers so you could use those to safely transport film to the lab. They'll be pretty safe outside of it, but it's extra safe if you can keep them in the storage containers. And then the next step is development. So in this video, we've talked about metering, shooting, and unloading film from both the Nikon FM10 and Rebel 2000 cameras. Thanks for making it to the end, everyone. Good luck.